Hello everyone, and good day to you wherever you are in the world, and welcome to Sensations English monthly webinar. It's already our third webinar of 2023 and our first with me as your host. I am Vicky, one of ELT specialists at Sensations English, and today we will be delighted to welcome our very own Fran Watkins, who is speaking on reading aloud, a useful or useless ELT activities for learners. Just a reminder that if you are watching this webinar live, a CPD certificate will be sent to your email 24 hours after the webinar has finished. And if you are watching the recording online, please make your own record of your professional development activities. The webinar will last an hour and will include time for questions at the end of Fran's talk. Please write your questions in the QA box. The QA button appears when you move your mouse to bottom of the Zoom window. If someone has already written the same question, you can click thumbs up button next to that question to move it higher up the list rather than writing it again. If you need any help during the webinar, please contact me in the chat box. Sensations English is focused on helping teachers develop their skills. We are delighted to be hosting regular webinars for teachers to support quality, evidence-based practice. You can review all our previous webinars on the Sensations English website, including our monthly webinars and a special series on using video in ELT. And these recordings all come with the slides from the sessions too. We hope they will help you develop your own practice and expand your use of authentic materials with the classes. Sensations English lesson resources are great new advance in ELT content. We are delighted to offer teachers hundreds of videos and news article resources, all graded at 5 CFR levels and all with ready-made learning activities. They make videos and news accessible to all learners and hassle-free for teachers. There are 3 new 5-level resources to use every week, giving you access to the most up-to-date content to use with your learners. Our Sensations English Teachers editions includes logins for all your students and the digital teacher gradebook tools, which lets you organize your students into classes, set tasks and monitor them live, and review your learners' progress over time. To start using the great resources in the Teachers Edition, just go to the link on the screen and in the chat box to sign up. Now, to let you a little more about today's speaker, Fran has many years experience as an ELT author, test writer, teacher, and a trainer. She holds a PGCE and MSc TEFL from Austin University and has worked in Europe as a teacher and a trainer for British Council and International House, as well as providing in-house teacher training and tutoring for CELTA and Delta courses. Prior to COVID, Fran worked at Reading University developing language and methodology skills of Chinese primary and secondary school teachers of English. Fran, thanks once again for being here. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see you all here, and thank you for joining me. I hope together we're going to move forward in our understanding of reading aloud today. So is it a useful or a useless activity? This is the question, and I hope by the end of the session you'll have a clearer idea of what you think about it. And when we're talking about reading aloud, we're just referring to the learners reading aloud, not the teacher, and we're not talking about drills. Okay, so it's often something like a story. I hope you can all read that now, everybody. Okay, so historically it was used as part and parcel of the grammar translation method, although it wasn't sort of in the manuals, it just became part of it. And then later on, it also became part of the audiolingual method when reading was just a kind of adjunct, if you like, to speaking. So speaking, the students were deemed to be speaking when they read aloud a text. So it's kind of been a technique that's been around for a while. And I think it's partly why it's so much of many of our classrooms these days. It's because it's historically there, it's deemed as language teaching. But I think what I want to do today is to kind of get us to question a little bit more. When are we using it? Why are we using it? How are we using it? I'll just, going back to the historical element, we'll just have a quick look at a modern day classroom of where reading aloud is used. This is taken from Diane Larson Freeman's books on techniques and principles in language teaching. So let's have a look at this classroom. Just have a read of that description. Okay, so the class are clearly reading a passage. Individuals are asked to read and then translate, with maybe the teacher helping them a little bit with any problems, and then they answer comprehension questions. Okay, that's something that we're looking at in this session, where the comprehension comes. Okay, but for now, what I'd like you to do is to think about what kind of things your learners do sometimes. What do they read aloud in your language classes? We're talking about in your English classes. What do you get them to read aloud? Can you write in the chat, please? Do you get them to read stories or what? Or dialogues for role play? Short stories, homework. That's interesting. Oh, I'd like to be a fly on the wall. Short text from the book, poetry. Well, a nice mixture here. Dialogues. Yeah, it makes sense to read out dialogues because they are spoken language, of course. A description of tasks. So some big things and some small things going on. Roles and dialogues in stories. Okay, lovely. Thank you. Let's move on. Nice rich variety there. And readers, finally. Lovely. Okay. So when I was preparing this session, I thought, yes, thank you. We'll move on now. Moving on to the CEF, the Common European Framework. I thought, well, I'll have a look at to see if they mention reading aloud in there. And it reminds us that activities like reading aloud are currently out of favour in communication-oriented language teaching, owing to their artificiality and undesirable backwash effects. A case can be made for them as testing devices. Okay, so interestingly, the CEF, sort of from a communicative perspective, seems to be poo-pooing reading aloud. It doesn't seem to like it. When it mentions testing devices, that's a different issue. It's not teaching, it's testing. And if anybody's interested in that, maybe we can talk about that at the end. For me, the thing about reading aloud, which makes it interesting enough to give a presentation on, is that it doesn't fit neatly with either reading or speaking or pronunciation alone or spelling. It kind of straddles multiple skills. And I think this is why it's interesting, but also why we've got to be careful of how we approach it in the lesson. Moving on, just thinking really quickly about reading aloud in our first language. I'm big on stories. I know some of you might have gone to my former session on retelling, but when we read aloud in our first language, it's important because stories have a strong impact on us emotionally. And reading aloud can be a way of sharing written stories. It's a very natural human activity. I like these natural human activities which are emotionally, have an emotional attachment to us. And so I was then started to think, okay, well, what do we actually read aloud in our first language? Okay, we read stories, maybe a fairy or a story to our children. Yeah, sometimes maybe an article from the news. Can you just jot really quickly now in your first language, think about the last time you read something aloud to somebody, maybe a colleague or a family member or a friend? What do we typically read aloud in our mother tongue or mother tongues? You've got more than one. Just a quick question. Any ideas? Mostly readers. Okay, so we're talking about in our first language. Yeah, reading stories to kids. Yeah, for those of you who are parents, exactly. Anything else? When my mum can't see something, I read for her. Interesting news on social media, poems, shopping lists. Yeah, I came up with shopping lists. Text messages, yes. Ads boards. That's an interesting one. Yeah. If you were standing next to somebody, you might read it out, or with a phone. Leaflets and brochures. Lovely, some lovely ideas. Recipes is definitely one. I find I'm doing that if I'm cooking or I'm telling my daughter. Yes, menus. Oh, lovely. So what's coming up here? Thank you. I'll stop you there. Otherwise, we'll use up too much time. But in reality, we actually do read aloud quite a lot in our first language. And what we haven't mentioned, of course, is the more formal reading aloud, when we might do a presentation, a speech at a wedding, a sermon, maybe a religious sermon or something like that. So there's all that element as well. So reading aloud is common. And anyway, it doesn't have to be completely authentic anyway, because of course there is the authenticity of the classroom itself. But an interesting digression, really. It is a natural activity. Now, the difference between reading aloud in our first language and our second language is quite clear to me, however. Outside the classroom, and I'm going to read this aloud, when we read aloud a text, for example, a story or an article or a menu or whatever, usually something bigger, we either already know or can predict the content. We may have read it before, or we're already immersed in it, in the topic or in the author, or we may actually be the actual writer. So I recently read a letter that I'd written to the council out to my husband to check it. And I actually wrote it. So we are familiar with the content, plus, of course, we're completely fluent readers. So we're not over relying on decoding. Okay, so it's automatic. My point being that as a reader, when you're reading in a second language, there's a lot to take on board. Okay, so I'm going to ask you now to put yourselves in your learner's shoes. Okay, so I'm going to give you a text. It's a difficult text. And I'm going to give you a few seconds to read it, and I'm going to ask one of you to read it out. Okay. Okay, you've got 10 seconds. Okay, truth is, I'm not going to ask you to read it out. That would be a bit cruel, wouldn't it? The text is hard, and you didn't have any. Hayley's written, what a relief. But that's my next question. What would you be concentrating on, and how would you be feeling if I did ask you to read that out to the group? Okay. Would you be approaching it with relish, or would you be very nervous? Yeah, you'd be nervous. Anything else? Uncomfortable, anxious, nervous, exactly, embarrassed, broken voice. And you, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, self-conscious, you would. I mean, even in your first language, a text like that would be tough, okay? Particularly tough because you haven't actually read it for content. You haven't read it for meaning yet, so you don't know what you're reading either. I gave you no lead in, I just plonked it on you. So you'd be feeling nervous, and what would you be concentrating on? I think I can tell you, as a language learner as well myself, you would be concentrating on how to pronounce it, okay, not really what it means, okay? And this is something that's really, really worth considering when you're getting students to read aloud. They're concentrating on pronunciation, yeah. This is leading us on then to the possible drawbacks of reading aloud, okay? Many students don't enjoy being put on the spot, especially, you know, if they're self-conscious teenagers in front of their peers. It's very stressful. It can be extremely time-consuming in a big class. Yeah. Other learners switch off as they don't understand, which Anna's just pointed out, and they aren't interested, or they simply cannot hear. I've been in that situation where, you know, you've got kids at the back, somebody's mumbling out a paragraph, it's painful, okay? And they're not reading it well, yeah. So their peers don't understand them because the reader doesn't understand what they're reading, and that creates even more of a barrier. So it seems that many of us, you might not be one of them, but many people, in my experience, don't fully understand how to use reading aloud. It's become a bit like a classroom routine where you go into a class and all the students hang up their coats and then they put their bags under the desk and they get all their things out. It's just a routine in the classroom, and people don't appreciate the difficulties and they don't think why they're doing it. Reading, as I'm sure you know, is a very complex process with top-down skills and bottom-up skills. So you're decoding, you're interpreting the written word, you're adding a semantic interpretation, and you're also using your world knowledge. So there's loads and loads of processes going on. The top-down skills, the bottom-up skills, which is the decoding from the written word up to the phrase, to the clause, to the sentence, to the paragraph. There's a lot of things going on. And if nothing else, I think I just want to remind you of that today, that reading, obviously it gets easier, that the more advanced you get, and it's less difficult, the easier the text. But we do have to remember that it is potentially a difficult activity. And then on top of that, we're throwing in, I want you to read it out loud. So you're throwing in that, you know, that oral reproduction of the graphic form. And we're talking about English, which isn't phonetic. The spelling is up the spout, which means it's a bit wild. So we're asking a lot. This is really interesting. I found a study, a Japanese study, which was used to show what happens to students' brains when they read aloud in their first language and in their second language. And they were put through scans to show how their brains they lit up. In other words, what parts of their brain and how much was activated. This was measured in a scan. The students had to read both Japanese and English, and they had to read different level texts easy, difficult, easy, average, difficult, okay? And what they found is that the learners reading in L2 had more lit up parts to their brain. In other words, there was more going on, there were more challenges, there was more, even more processing going on. And interestingly, they found that with the difficult text, actually fewer parts of the brain lit up. And it was almost as if their brain gave up. There was just too much going on, and it was like, oh, just give me a break, okay? What I also found interesting was the students' actual responses, because as we said earlier about focusing on pronunciation, what they said that was with the difficult piece in English, what they were concentrating on was vocalization of the words. Several of them said this, okay? Reading the difficult English passage aloud was difficult, could only catch the key words, attention on the pronunciation. Same here. Same here. So they actually didn't understand what they were reading. So what's the point? I mean, they're reading it all wrong. And this chimes with, I don't know if you've heard of cognitive load theory. This theory tends to relate more to first language learning, but it is used also in L2. And it's just about the sheer amount of processing that we can take on. I'll just give you this key quote. So we need to think about when we're reading aloud, you know, how much can they do it? Is this the right time and the place? Am I asking them to do the right amount, etc.? Okay, but we've sounded a bit negative so far, but what are the good things about reading aloud, and is it worthwhile? Well, Gabriel Atos writes that it's detrimental to reading skills because it slows their reading down. And he questions if it even helps speaking. But he says it is useful for phonology, and this is my feeling, really, amongst other things. And Gibson says that despite its poor record, the role of reading aloud should be appraised because it has lots of benefits. And there are lots of good reasons for doing reading aloud, providing the timing and approach is right, which we're going to look at in just a couple of minutes. Okay, and these for me are some of the other advantages. I like to think in terms of heads down and heads up in a lesson. In a reading lesson, you've got lots of heads down. But one way of introducing a little bit of variety is to get people to read around. And later on, in a few minutes, we're going to look at ways of making that a bit more colourful. I know this because I'm a language learner and I like speaking aloud. This is an important one. I think if you know what you're reading, reading aloud can actually help to move it into your long-term memory and help you recall it better. I hope I'm not going too fast for you. These slides will all be available. I know that you won't be able to process them all right now. Okay, as I say, I might enjoy reading aloud myself. And Stevik, in his book, found when he was writing about what makes a good language learner, found that many of the good language learners used reading aloud as a learning technique. So, just some learners here, some learners at the bottom explicitly need or want to read aloud. And this is important as well, because I've had several learners recently who've actually asked to read aloud. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's fine, but I'm quite careful usually how I approach it. These are some of my learners who wanted to read aloud. So rich variety, but worth pointing out that all of them, except for the politician, who was very, very familiar with his speech, they were all advanced learners. So the cognitive load otherwise can be too high, but these were really, really strong learners. And so I was happy to read aloud with them. Okie dokie. This is important for teachers. So for us, reading aloud can be a useful indicator of a learner's understanding of a text. Because when a student reads out a text, usually, unless they're very advanced, usually how they read it tells you whether they've understood it or not, okay? It's because of the way that they place the pausing and they place the tonic stress. So what's the general procedure? How do we put reading aloud successfully into a class? Learners need to understand what they're reading about to reduce the cognitive load, even if this just means that you read something first, so at least they've heard it once, okay? But ideally, some sort of comprehension task. And they might also need support before they read aloud. Okay, so this is important. They need to know what they're reading aloud. So ideally, even if we're talking about readers, ideally, they should be allowed to read it at home first so that they know what's coming up in terms of the content. Okay, how does it work in the classroom? So first of all, remove this comprehension block. As I said, bare minimum, you read it aloud first, okay? If we're talking about a novel, it is a little bit different because they're already immersed in the story. But as I said, what's one way of getting around that, unless the written text is at a very easy level for them, is to get them to prepare at home. Use random nomination. Okay, this is a simple reminder, but I spoke to my daughter about this because she studied French at school and she used to read text aloud. I just asked her, do you read text aloud? Yes, yes. But the teacher used to ask them in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So she said that what they do in the lesson, they'd count ahead and see which sentence was theirs. And so they wouldn't be listening to the story or whatever. They'd just be preparing their sentence and then they'd read it aloud. I mean, if you are going to do that, please use random nomination. You can use the wheel of names that you can find online, or you can just put names in a hat or read out names from a register. Sometimes do reading aloud in pairs or small groups, not in front of the class. So they can practice in groups, you can assist, and then maybe select one group to read aloud in the class. So it's a group effort. Quick question here for you in the chat. What difference might this make? Why might it be a good idea to do reading aloud in groups, not to the whole class? Any ideas? Is it simply for variety? You want to have a sit down? Exactly. Yeah. This is all about giving learners confidence. They might feel much more comfortable. The shy students, thank you, might feel much more comfortable. And I don't know why we don't do more of this. You know, if some learners have professed to liking reading aloud in small groups, so why not get them to do this and just give 10 minutes at the end of the lesson when they don't have that pressure on them. Yeah. Sometimes allow for rehearsal time. Okay, whether they're reading aloud to the whole class or just in groups, this is your time when you can go round. If anybody wants you to say the sentence for them or the paragraph, you can help them. Okay, so give them a little rehearsal time if they know they're going to speak in front of a group or the class. Okay, does anybody need any help? Put your hand up and I'll come and help you. We've got 5 minutes to prepare. Okay. Let learners hear you or the recording first. unless the text is really easy for them. If it's really easy for them, then comprehension isn't a problem. So some of these issues that we're talking about won't be a barrier. And just to remind you here, that Sensations allows you to hear the audio as well as providing the transcript. So these sites where you can listen and see the transcript, building up to learners becoming news readers, can be really, really useful. And we were talking about the high cognitive load. If you can see this panel here at the bottom, select level. What you could do is you could even read aloud, having maybe watched the video, etc., at a higher level. If you're going to read aloud maybe at the end of the class, you could even go down a level. They know the content, it's the same, but the language is a little bit easier to process. Okay, that reduces the cognitive load. Give reading aloud substance. Make it meaty. It's not just a classroom routine like hanging up their coat. Discuss the reasons. Give praise where appropriate to readers, not necessarily individuals, but to the class, and discuss their progress. This might be individual or as a group. Treat it as a valued learning and teaching strategy, not just part of the routine. Discuss the challenges, the fears, what makes it easier for them or more difficult. Give learners choices. Okay, so again, you can ask your class, okay, today we're going to read aloud for the last 10 minutes. Okay, we're going to read either the passage that we read today or from our readers or whatever, and you can give them some of these choices. It makes them more involved, it empowers them, and you find out more what they think about reading aloud as well. It again gives it substance, just like we said on the previous slide. And then try shadow reading as well. Shadow reading is where you read along, you read the transcript with the actual, with the voice at the same time, okay? So we're just gonna have a quick practice of this, and we're going to look at a piece on Saudi women who've started working as mechanics in Saudi Arabia. This is a fairly recent text. You're going to listen and watch, because this one's a video. Sensations has either videos or articles. You're going to watch the video and listen and answer these 3 questions. What I'll do is I'll share my screen so that you can see the questions and the video. Okay, so stop share. Okay, so hopefully you can see now let me know, Vicky or anybody, if you can't see that. You should be able to see Yes,
we can.
You can, okay, great. Okay, I'm going to play the B1 plus intermediate, and you're just going to watch. I won't give you the subtitles and I won't give you the transcript. You're just listening for comprehension, for meaning. Okay. Okay, and hopefully you can hear it.
Women are starting to work on cars in garages across Saudi Arabia. The government's expanding women's rights to work as part of the country's economic plan. This moves towards Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's strategy to widen the nation's economy by 2030. The first step, which happened in 2018, gave women the right to drive. Now they're training as mechanics and working on those cars, just like their male colleagues. The chance to become a mechanic was a dream come true for Angham Jadawi.
My dream was to enter the automotive field, but for a Saudi woman, this field was not available. So when the opportunity came, I applied straight away and was accepted.
Although the chance to learn a technical trade appeals to some women, customers are still getting used to the idea. The women are often asked about their interest in cars, explains Ola Flimban.
At the beginning, they were all surprised. Some customers came up to me and said, "You shocked us. You surprised us." They are surprised that girls work in this field and ask us to explain how we fell in love with this field. This is the most common question.
The increase in rights opens up more opportunities for women in Saudi Arabia. However, they're still required to get permission from their husband. Ola had no problem getting her husband Rafat's agreement.
Now she has experience in different car types, how to change oil, how to check cars. She's even checking my car.
Younger generations are adapting to these workplace shifts rapidly. The priority is that people are trained well, for university student Meshal.
If they are here, it must mean they are trained, and maybe they understand my car better than me. So it's normal.
Okay, so that was the video. And then what I'd like you to do is shadow read. So as I said, this is when you read along with the newsreader. And so I'm going to give you the first two paragraphs, okay? I would just like you to read these two paragraphs in your own head. Okay, and I'm really doing this so that you can get it what it feels like to shadow read, really. I prefer it when there is no time lapse, so I try and get my learners to read along with the actual recording. You might have a giggle and it might fail at first, but give it, 2 or 3 goes and you'll find that your learners get better at it and they'll see it as a bit of a laugh and a challenge. So let me take this. Let's play again, okay? The speaking starts soon after the car has moved to the front and they open up the bonnet at the front. Just a quick reminder, in a class, obviously you'd spend more time doing the comprehension stage before you do this reading aloud stage. Okay, off we go.
Women are starting to work on cars in garages across Saudi.
Well, I hope you're actually trying to read aloud. So you should be trying to read aloud with the speaker now, okay, at the same time. Just have a go. Have a go.
Women are starting to work on cars in garages across Saudi Arabia. The government's expanding women's rights to work as part of the country's economic plan. This moves towards Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's strategy to widen the nation's economy by 2030. The first step, which happened in 2018, gave women the right to drive. Now they're training as mechanics and working on those cars, just like their male colleagues.
Okay, so you get the idea. Your learners might need much more assistance than that. You might just be able to do it with a couple of sentences. They might need to practice much more with you first. We'll look at how in a minute. But let them have a go. And I think you'll find that they get better with it. And you could argue that this helps the language to go in. They get more of a feel of the musicality of the language and all those things. And just to remind also that on sensations, you can also use the subtitles. So I'll just show you quickly.
The chance to become a mechanic was a dream come true for Anke.
Okay, so I'm going to scroll down now because actually there is a facility, if you are interested, called Shadowing the Newsreader, where you can do this line by line, okay, on the Sensations site if you're interested. If they're doing it individually, they can record themselves, but I've sometimes just used it in a class like this.
Women are starting to work on cars in garages across Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so you can break it down in that way if you want to and build it up and then do the reading aloud. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to go back to my original PowerPoint now. Okay, so my next suggestion is to do more explicit pronunciation work, because I'm sure some of you were thinking, my learners wouldn't be able to read that aloud, they'd need more help. Of course they would. So either you can go down a level, give them something easier to read out, or you can give them more support to help with their pronunciation, okay? And you can pick out various things, specific sound problems, syllables, word stress, features of connected speech, or the tonic stress, okay? It depends on your learners and you might want to vary it, okay? So this is just some examples of explicit pron work. You wouldn't be able to do the whole text, okay? So some problem sounds might be for your learners various diphthongs. So in the blue, we've got A, 18, gave, training, male, okay? Then we've got other diphthongs here, right, drive, the I, then we've got the ow and the o, okay? Or they might have problems with individual words like these. Mechanics is always a tricky one, as is colleagues, okay? So you could do that, and
the first,
you could also do picking out this tonic stress and the intonational phrases, which I think is really, really useful with all levels of learners. Okay, so you can get them to put in the phrase marks. They listen and then they usually predict where the phrases are. Then they listen and match, see if they're right, and then they pick out the key word. Okay, or you can give them this and they practice it and then read along with the text. So just let me show you how this works.
The first step, which happened in 2018, gave women the right to drive. Now they're training as mechanics and working on those cars, just like their male colleagues.
I hope you can see how that works. So I did a session earlier on tonic stress. So that's related to this, but it's a great way to help them become good newsreaders, to read aloud successfully. And you might just want to start with a sentence and then build it up.
The first step.
Let's move on. Another way is to gamify reading aloud. And we talked earlier about doing things in groups, but with a piece like this, you've actually got 5 speakers with the narrator. So it's perfect for breaking up and practicing in groups, and then maybe getting one group to perform it in front of the class, okay? And another thing that you can do with high-level learners is to challenge them, once they've got used to reading aloud with no hesitation or repetition. Okay, that's an extra for very strong learners. Okay, we're coming to an end here. This is one of Jeremy Harmer's ideas, which I really like. It's a real life activity, because often when we read an article, we say, hey, look, it says here, and he says that you've been working with the text. At the end of the lesson, maybe you'd ask them to pick out a sentence that they like, they practice it in their head, and then they say to their partner or the group, oh, it says here, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so they're reading aloud to the group or to the class. And you could vary this using one of those quotes here. There's one line I found really interesting. Listen to this, or I like this bit. Yeah, it's a very natural activity. And also memorization. Okay, now this, I don't know whether you'd agree with this one, but just occasionally, if it's a manageable text, why not give them each a sentence? Remember, they've already digested the text with content, and then at the end of the lesson, you allocate one sentence to each student. If you've got a big class, you might have to divide it into two. They prepare it, you go around and help if necessary, and then you conduct it. Okay, so you start off, number 1, 2, and then they read aloud their sentence. Okay, it gamifies it again, really. But, you know, memorization, imagine that sentence is going to stick. Okay, and use it to round off, not begin a skills class. Okay, just a quick idea, why not get students to sometimes read aloud a short passage as a whole class together, okay, with you. Okay, again, this is at the end of the class, or you could divide it into boys and girls, or half the class do one sentence, then half the class the next. If you're worried about your students getting sloppy, you know how if you're sometimes reading aloud, then it gets all very chaotic. I do 3 claps at the end of each sentence, and then they restart with the next sentence. And then it ensures that everybody stays in unison. And so Gimson says, if reading aloud is used insensitively or inappropriately, the objections to it are still valid. However, given the approval of reading aloud by the researchers, it is not reading aloud in itself that is bad practice, but its misuse. That sounds a bit negative. I mean, basically, she, like me, thinks that it is a valid activity, but it has to be treated with a bit of caution. It can be extremely worthwhile for both learners and teachers, not least for pronunciation and for indicating level of understanding. This bit's for the teacher. Handled properly and in a varied way, it can be enjoyable, giving light and shade to a lesson, but it needs to be approached in the right way, not cold. Okay, you need to allow learners to focus on how to vocalize the words, having already understood the content. Okay, I think that's my dog there. I think that's me done. So, any questions or
Thank you very
comments?
much, Fran. It was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.
That's okay.
I have a couple of questions for you from everyone. So one of our attendees, I hope I pronounce his name correctly, Amir, is asking, how can we pinpoint whether a young learner struggles with dyslexia or is a slow reader when reading loud?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I mean, personally, I would be wary of asking young learners, you know, it depends how young your young learner is, but I'd be a bit careful about asking young learners to read aloud. I think if you're worried about an individual student, even an older one, I would maybe get them to read, to speak to you after the lesson and get them to read a little bit just to you one-on-one, and maybe you can get an idea. And I think if you have got a learner who is clearly having problems with reading aloud, unless they really want to, I wouldn't ask them. I wouldn't ask them to read aloud in the class, because you're likely to be putting that student on the spot and demotivating them. And you're sure to be demotivating the peers, the listeners who won't be hearing good example. Yeah.
Is reading aloud possible in online classes?
I think with caution, I would say if it's a big class, unless they're adults, if it's a big class, I would say no. If it's a smaller class of higher level students, and you ask them if they like doing it, I would try it. Yes, it's doable. I think the bigger the class and the lower the level, the more questionable it is.
Yeah.
If you've got higher levels and it's not a massive class and you've asked them whether they like it and what they get out of it, then you can try it. Yes.
Yes, exactly. Is there any correlation between reading aloud and speaking fluency?
Reading aloud and speaking fluently. Do you know what? I don't know the answer to that question. Reading aloud and speaking fluently. There certainly is a correlation between effective reading and reading aloud successfully, but I actually don't know. I really don't know, but that's a really interesting question.
Okay, that's fine. So, you know, somebody else asked, I'm worried how much students will react if I take a reading aloud approach in my classes. Have you had any, or what advice you can give?
That's a really good question, and thank you for raising it. I would certainly not suddenly, if you don't do it already, suddenly start reading aloud loads. This is one of your tools, you know, as a teacher. It's in your repertoire. It's something that you can pull out maybe once every 2 weeks or even once a month. You know, if your students like it, then do it more, but certainly don't go mad. But, you know, I'm sure that all of us, we all do readings in a lesson. Yeah. And a lot of us, I hope you might not be one of them, but a lot of us, I think, don't put enough focus on pronunciation. Okay, this way you're doing at the very minimum, you're potentially helping them with some pronunciation. Yeah. And if it's likely also that you might be helping them with their motivation, with their memorization, even possibly with their comprehension. So I would use it, but do it little and often. Yeah, if you've had a news story, then at the end of the lesson, if you've got 5 minutes spare, why not say, I know, let's read it aloud. I'll give you 3 minutes to read it aloud, and then I'm going to pick some individuals. Yeah, maybe the first time you try it, you can ask them to put up their hands. Who wants to read? Yeah, so maybe the first 1 or 2 times do let learners say if they want to read. Yeah. And then afterwards do it more randomly, or maybe start doing it in groups or with their partners. Okay.
Yeah, that's a really good. And do you think that would be useful for dictations activities when they, you know, they have to read out the sentences? Would that work over there for dictation classes?
It's certainly a different kind of lesson. Yeah, I mean, it's different to the ideas that I was thinking about, where you were dealing with a text and then you've had the comprehension and then you read it aloud. But absolutely, dictations where they're dictating to one another is kind of a step on from this. Yeah, again, I wouldn't do a dictation activity unless the language is very, very easy. I wouldn't do a dictation to a peer reading aloud unless the level is quite high. Otherwise it's just painful.
Yeah. And how would you adapt reading aloud to apply in the classes of young learner?
Reading aloud, I mean, in primary schools in this country, reading aloud isn't a common feature. I have to be honest. I think when you get to junior, you know, and young secondary phases, it's more common. I think, you know, with children, you could try it, but remember that there's going to be a huge range, particularly at primary school, in level. And you don't want to put them on the spot. You don't want children to be laughed at. So again, play it by ear. If you think your learners would like to, you know, maybe just let them read a little bit. But I personally think if you're talking about stories and things, many children would actually just prefer to hear you or the audio read a story. Yeah. But that's a good question.
And one last question for you. Is there anything you can think of that is important for school managers to do to support teachers in reading aloud approaches in the classes?
I think just experiment. You know, it's teachers in the classroom sharing ideas. You know, take 1 or 2 ideas from here, read around a bit and try 1 or 2 more. and feedback to your fellow teachers and say what worked and what didn't work. And remember to ask your learners, did you enjoy that? What was the point of doing it? What was difficult? What was easy? Do you think it's getting easier? You know, and try and do a range of ideas. You know, if it becomes a routine, you know, every time we do a text, we're going to read aloud randomly, then it all gets a bit predictable and samey. So, you know, variety is the key.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, that's all we have time for.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for an incredible talk. And just a reminder for everyone else here, I'm just going to go to my slides and just let you know that Sensations English webinars for teachers will be back next month with a webinar. You can catch up on any webinars you miss at sensationsenglishwebinars.co.uk, and remember to share them with your colleagues via social media. And you can visit our website for greater learning resources and sign up to our teachers training and teachers editions to get the great resources always at 5 levels, A2 to C1, to use with your all learners. And if anyone wants to continue to, you know, have a conversation on this topic in more details, you can comment and reply to our post dedicated to this talk on our social media channels like Facebook page, Twitter and Instagram. You can also follow the links I'm just going to put up for you on the chat box in order, you know, to share it with your colleagues and on your platform. I'm just putting up the links for everyone. Okay. Once again, Fran, thanks very much for that wonderful talk, and to everyone here for taking time to be here today. Have a lovely day or a night, and wherever you are in the world, goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.